Have you ever stood on a boat at midnight and felt like the sea was holding its breath, waiting to show you something you should never have asked to see? I did, and what looked back at me that night changed everything I believed about the deep. My name is Jonah Hale. I'm 34 years old, and on July 14, 2019, something grabbed more than my attention off the coast of a place locals call Blackwater Shoals. I grew up inland, but water ran in my veins anyway. The slow, steady pull of rivers and the stories of old sailors my grandfather told. By 30, I was the kind of man who could read a tide chart like a poem and tell you the mood of a storm by the way gulls folded their wings. That summer, I was working as a dive safety officer and part-time cameraman for a small film crew making a documentary about unexplored continental shelf canyons. We were a ragged group but close. Rosa Vega, our head diver and fearless planner. Ethan Cross, a sound tech who talked too loud and laughed too soft. And Captain Silas Boone, a man with an old weathered face who navigated like he was following his ancestors' footsteps under the water. Blackwater Shoals had a reputation, more myth than map. Fishermen avoided it at night, and the town's bait shop had a bulletin board with yellowing clippings and hand-scrawled warnings pinned under a picture of a sunken trawler. We went because that was the point, to push where others turned back. We had permits, sonar, expensive lights, and a quiet arrogance that comes with believing equipment always wins against mystery. The first part of the trip was all setup and small victories. We filmed plankton blooms that glowed like ghostly fireworks. We caught footage of a rare lanternfish and got a laugh when Ethan's mic picked up the weird, high-frequency chatter of something none of us could name. At noon, we took measurements, checked the gear, and joked about sea monsters as a way to keep the nerves light. Rosa was the only one who treated the ocean like an old acquaintance. She'd press her hand to the rail and whisper where the currents had taken her in other dives. "It listens," she'd say, with a grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. Boone would only mutter about tides and time, the way a man who'd lived alongside the coast all his life does. He'd been raised near Brackett Harbor and carried a map of it in his head like a confession. We chose July 14 because the weather forecast promised a few calm nights, the kind where the moon paints a silver path and the sea seems almost polite. We anchored at dusk about a mile seaward from the shoal's marked boundary. The first few hours were routine, rope checks, camera calibrations, and the kind of listless conversation that fills time on a long trip. But there was an odd hush to the water that night, like someone had smoothed the surface with their palm. The sonar hummed, and instead of the usual noisy return we expected, there was a silent hole on the screen, a void that looked almost artistically like an absence. We discussed theory for half an hour. Deep gullies, gas pockets, rogue thermoclines that could play tricks on instruments. That's when Ethan, always with the hand mic close, told us he'd heard rhythm in the water. A pattern. Like a heartbeat, he said. We laughed. We were professionals, after all. Still, we adjusted the mic, recorded another pass, and made notes. If you want a documentary to feel real, you look for patterns. If you want to survive, you pay attention to what the patterns are trying to tell you. The crew had their own private histories that made the mission matter. Rosa had lost a sister to a diving accident years before. She carried that with her like a bandage. Ethan had a little boy who thought his dad could capture whales on camera and swing them like toys. Boone, with his slow drawl, had come down to Blackwater when he was a kid and swore the sea had given him his first coin and taken the same coin back sometimes. Those stories made us human. They also made the night feel like it was a stage, and we were actors who hadn't learned our lines. We planned 2 dives, a shallow reconnaissance and later a more ambitious night drop to target a narrow canyon the sonar had highlighted. By the time the second watch came around, we'd already collected more footage than anticipated. The moon had climbed higher, and a low fog ribboned the horizon. I remember the way the deck lights threw long, trembling shadows that looked like fingers. We suited up around midnight. Rosa checked my harness with the kind of meticulous focus only people who trust their lives to ropes and valves possess. "Stay sharp," she said. "If the ocean's telling us something, we'll listen." That's where the setup ends and where the main story starts, but not yet. Before the dive, we ate cold sandwiches and told little truths, the kind people offer one another to hold hands against fear. Ethan complained about a creaky hinge back home. Boone told of an old storm where his father had steered a ship through fog by smell alone. Rosa talked about the silence she could feel beneath the water, as if the ocean kept its secrets in a place words couldn't reach. I told them about the dream I'd had the night before, a massive shape circling our boat, patient and slow, like it was studying the way light bent off our hull. We climbed down the ladder to the water in pairs, ropes and lines like lifelines. The visibility under Blackwater's surface at night was muted. Lights turned everything into an exaggerated monochrome. We dropped into a weightless world. The canyon was like a cathedral cut from black stone, its walls pocked with folds that swallowed our light. At around 500 words, that's when the current shifted, slightly at first, a gentle tug that felt like a large hand running along the back of a whale. We signaled to each other, checked our gauges, and descended. Then the ocean answered. It was a sound that didn't belong to water, a low, grinding chorus from the dark below and a pressure wave that made the hair along my arms stand erect. For a heartbeat, I thought some gigantic fish had passed. Then Rosa's light swung left and caught movement. Slow, deliberate, enormous. Not a fish, not a whale. Something with the suggestion of limbs or arms curling and uncurling like ship's cables, but living and slick. The first touch was a mere brush across my calf, a cold feather that sent a bell-like chime of panic through my chest. My breath hitched. Ethan's light flared, and the beam picked up a pattern. Rows of mottled vents and a skin the color of midnight oil, ridged and scarred like ancient armor. Tentacles, thick as tree trunks, coiled in and out of the canyon mouth. They moved with purpose, not the blind frenzy of a feeding frenzy, but with a knowing patience, as though weighing whether to invest energy in us at all. Rosa yelled through the regulator, but the sound was muffled in my ears. Boone's voice came in over the comms on the boat, sharp and urgent, telling us to ascend, to get to the surface. When we tried to move, the current closed in like fingers. One tentacle looped and held the ladder rope at the stern, while another curled around the submersible light we used for filming, crushing it until it burst into a scattering of bubbles. My world reduced to the hiss of my regulator, the dark, and the weight of something immense pressing at the edges of my vision. I thought of all the myths, krakens and sea serpents told in children's books and late-night taverns. I thought perhaps myth had been a polite word for something real but unspoken. The creature didn't attack with teeth or gore. Instead, it immobilized, exploring with grips and grooves, palpating us like specimens. Rosa fought like a cornered animal, slashing lights in wide arcs, and in one movement freed Ethan's leg from a loop. For a second, we were three bodies in a black cathedral, fighting to move up, while ropes creaked and the sea hummed like an enormous insect. At the surface, the boat was chaos. People were shouting, lines were snapping, and sloshing sounds told me that something had ripped the stern ladder free. I felt a tug, a deliberate, horrifying suggestion that I might be pulled beneath. For a moment, I thought of the small things that made me a person. A photograph tucked in my wallet, my father's laugh on the phone, Ethan's boy, and how he'd hop around pretending to be a whale. Then I kicked, hard. Rosa caught my hand and hauled. The creature reacted like a large animal, annoyed, recoiling enough for us to breathe. We made it aboard by the skin of our teeth. The boat's hull had deep gouges, like the marks of a claw, and a waterlogged mass of what looked like skin and bioluminescent scars floated in the wake. The cameras, our proof, our reason for the risk, had recorded slivers of the encounter. Darkness, the arc of a tentacle, a plate-like surface that reflected our light like a crow's eye. We left as fast as a motor and a shaken captain could manage, cutting across the shoal with the radio crackling and an engine whining like a wounded animal. In the days after, people argued about what we'd seen. Scientists offered hypotheses: unknown cephalopod, colossal squid, an abnormal aggregation of known species enlarged by unique conditions. The footage went to university labs. The lab techs were clinical but hollow-eyed in the break room. Some fishermen refused to speak of Blackwater shoals again. Rosa took a leave of absence. Ethan started bringing his boy on shore walks and refused to go back to sea. I stopped reading The Smell of Rain the way I used to, and sometimes wake with the taste of salt and a phantom pressure on my ribs. We didn't learn all the answers that night, and perhaps that's why the memory clings. Monsters, I discovered, don't have to be alt and gore to be monstrous. A patient intelligence in the dark, an awareness that sizes you up, that is terrifying in a way that primal horror isn't. We left with more questions than facts, and a film reel that glints like a shard, enough to make people listen and not enough to make them believe. The sea keeps its secrets. Sometimes it returns small tokens to those who trespass. Pieces of skin, a scale, a noise on a windless morning. I keep my token in a box under the bed, and at times I will open it, touch it, and remember the way the ocean looked at me that night. Ancient, patient, and not indifferent. I still go to the shore because leaving means forgetting, and forgetting means repeating. But when I stand there now, I watch the horizon with a different kind of respect, and I sleep with the deck light on more often than not. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. Have you ever felt like the ocean knew your name before you did? That small, polite feeling you get at the edge of the pier? What if it was recognition and not welcome? That question is where my memory begins. My name is Nolan Price. I was 32 years old on August 14th, 2019, when the sea decided to introduce itself properly. Greyhaven was the kind of New England harbor that wore memory like barnacles, layered, stubborn, and impossible to scrape clean. I grew up there, learned to sail and to fear certain tides. The harbor had stories the way a town breathes. Quiet tales about lights on foggy nights, a captain who swore a shadow followed his trawler, a child pulled back from the water by an unseen hand. Those stories were gossip to most, cautionary tales to parents, until the night we crossed Marrow Bank. Our mission sounded prosaic. Dr. Evelyn Shaw, a marine biologist with a taste for puzzles, had a string of odd sonar readings from a week of trawls. She wanted live tagging, simple transmitters dropped on large schooling fish so she could track movement through the mesopelagic. She chartered the Sea Harrier, a stout 32-foot vessel, and hired Jonah Hale, Silas Finch, Lila Monroe, and me. Jonah was a mechanic who spoke in blunt metaphors. Silas, a fisherman who timed his breaks with the moon. Lila ran charters by day and built furniture by night. We were ordinary people with ordinary debts and a shared love for the boundary where land and water argued. Before we left, Dr. Shaw sat on the dock and gave me a packet. Annotated charts, a note about unusual resonance patterns, and a furrowed look that didn't match the paper. "Keep the tags away from the surface when you deploy them," she told me, tapping the envelope. "Something down there is responding to the noise." She sounded like someone making a polite plea to a jury. I nodded. We all nodded, the way people nod when they don't want to be the ones who say no. We traded small-town bravado for careful measures. Fishermen who once raced the dark now set lines shallow, and harbor lights stayed on until batteries failed. Old warnings pinned to docks began to sound like instructions, and nights felt smaller and farther from the water's edge. We drifted toward Marrow Bank because curiosity is heavier than caution when a scientist pays for fuel. We talked about everything trivial to keep our nerves steady. Old girlfriends, bad dinners, the town's baseball scores. And in that talk, the sea was an abstract thing, a backdrop for stories we assumed would not answer back. Jonah made a joke about bad coffee to cut the tension, and Silas hummed an old sea hymn while Lila kept the boat steady and precise. The details of our work were routine at first: deploy, ping, record, move. Dr. Shaw's notes were precise, and in daylight we would have trusted them as gospel. At night, though, even gospel looks like a riddle. Around midnight, the sea lost its ordinary voice. Air chilled sharply and an oily film feathered the surface, catching our lights in dull, shifting bands. The first thing that rose was a section of skin, mottled like river stone, ribbed with concentric ridges. It broke the water without splash, like a cathedral door opening. For a second, we watched with the dizzy academic calm of people who mistake observation for safety. Jonah muttered. Silas made a small, sharp sound that could have been a prayer. Dr. Shaw's charts had a scribble I had missed, a void surface resonance. The warning echoed now. When the creature exhaled, the sound felt wrong for marine life, an orchestral creak that filled the night. Something in me recognized structure and age. The skin flexed and a bright yellow tag we had dropped drifted into a fold. It slid in as if receiving a message. Then the main body rolled, and dozens of smaller eel-like forms poured from a cavity along its flank, like siblings from a womb. They moved in vertical slits of light, intelligence threaded through each dart. Lila put the engine ahead, but the boat lurched as something heavy snagged the rudder. The sea harrier tilted and water swamped the stern. Smaller creatures clung to the hull, their bites stung. Jonah hit the rail with everything he could find. A flare burst and painted the sea orange. For a heartbeat, the creatures recoiled. Not with animal panic, but with the precision of beings taking measure. Then the larger thing revealed its scale. It wrapped itself around half the boat with the intimacy of a claim. Not a predator tearing, but a slow, possessive hold. In the light, its ridges looked like armor plates etched with growth rings, and where its skin peeled back, there were openings that suggested long tunnels, not simply mouths. It was territorial. We fought with whatever we had. We cut lines, threw weight and light and noise toward it, and tried to keep Lila at the helm. Instruments sang with strange resonance that matched patterns the creatures seemed to emit. Our world of steel and signal suddenly spoke the wrong language under the sea. At one point, a tag we had affixed to a fish drifted into a fold of that skin as if being read, and the water around the location bloomed with the smaller forms, like a nest revealing itself. Everything happened in compressed shards. Jonah yanking a tag free, Silas hauling at a rope, a flare hissing into the black. The sea harrier juddered as if bruised. Wood screamed. We were small, bright things in a patient darkness that had its own map and its own memory. For reasons I still can't parse, the light and noise and raw human chaos confused them enough to make them pull away. Dawn found us bruised, the boat scarred, and the radio full of normal chatter that had no context for what happened in the dark. Back in Greyhaven, people filed reports and some scientists drafted cautious papers. Jonah's footage circulated with debate. Some scoffed, others hushed. The harbor learned a new prudence. Shallower nets, longer lights, and fewer late runs, none of us forgot. What we learned is inadequate and precise at once. The ocean holds architecture older than our maps. Whatever we woke that night was not malevolent in a human sense. It was ancient and territorial and exquisitely adapted to a world where silence still held sway. It reacted to our noise, to the tags, to the way we invaded a vertical boundary we didn't understand. We returned with proof and questions. Dr. Shaw published measured findings about unusual echolocation signatures and emergent behavior in mesopelagic layers. Scientists called, journalists asked. NOAA filed an anomalous report. In town, the conversation took on a fine grain. People who had once laughed about sea ghosts now pointed at the horizon like it held an accusation. To me, the memory remains a ledger of small moments. The feel of barnacled wood under my hands, Jonah's breath loud and human beside me, the sea harrier listing like a boat that had learned to bow. I kept a light on, always watching. It taught me, the deep keeps borders we forget. Crossing them does not promise a return. If you ask me what they were, I would tell you what the machines told us, unknown. If you ask me whether I would go back, I have told myself both yes and no, depending on what kind of courage I can borrow from sleep. What I do know is this: the sea responds when you push into its old mistakes, and sometimes it calls you home. This story is over. Get ready for the next one. My name is Ethan Cole. I was 32 when it happened on October 14, 2017. Have you ever stared out over Black Sea and felt something the size of a small country breathe under the waves, patient, ancient, and curious about you? That memory won't let me sleep. I tell this as a true thing that happened to me off the jagged coast of Cape Hallow, a place locals call Gull's Hollow, 3 miles past the last light buoy. I worked then as a commercial diver and deckhand on a small research charter called the Seafarer. I wasn't famous, just a kid who grew up salt deep in his veins. My father, Tom Cole, had been a tugboat engineer, and I learned knots before I could tie my shoes properly. The day I turned 32, we were supposed to test a new remote submersible for a marine research outfit out of New Bedford. An ordinary job, ordinary pay, ordinary weather at first. Gray, with low cloud and a steady, bone-deep cold wind. Characters matter here because they kept me alive long enough to tell you this. Captain Roy Dalton was 60, a lined man with hands like planks and a laugh that could start storms. My closest friend on deck was Logan Finch, 28, sharp-jawed, the kind of man who nailed fishing hooks with more precision than he spoke. There was Dr. Helen Marks, the marine biologist who'd convinced the company to fund the test because of anomalous acoustic readings in the charts. Helen's notebook became a talisman. She scribbled in block letters and kept the radio on what she called listener frequency. No one expected the ocean to answer. Before October 14th, we were already talking about strange things. Fishermen swapped gossip about nets torn clean as paper at night, buoys vanishing between watches, and whale carcasses found shredded in ways that didn't match teeth marks. Old-timers in port told stories, call them superstitions or folklore, about long singers that swim in the continental shelf and prefer the dark. We laughed then, a kind of nervous, polite laughter, the way people laugh to keep fear from settling in. Logan and I ran through our checks on the Seafarer at dawn. The remote submersible, nicknamed Poe by Roy, was a matte black torpedo with a camera and sonar designed to dive deeper and longer than anything we'd used. Helen was excited the way a scientist is when her theory finally meets instruments. She kept saying pattern and irregular echo and how curious it all was. Curiosity was a currency on that boat. We traded it like cigarettes. We eased away from the harbor under a sky that looked like spilled ink. The sea at first was a sheet of dull pewter, and gulls kept us company, riding thermals and hungrily eyeing our bait. We anchored over a trench where the charts dropped off, where the shelf fell into deeper water, and Helen wired Poe to the deck. In the warm clutter of instruments and muffled conversation, you could forget the scale of the blue abyss yawning beneath. You could forget that the ocean was older than maps, older than names. For the first few hours, the dive was textbook. Poe's little lights blinked, the camera fed back footage of brooding rock and columns of plankton glowing like distant city lights. Then the sonar pinged a pattern that made Helen sit very still. It was a slow, rhythmic echo, too regular for whales, too soft for a submarine. "Look," she said, voice low. The ping repeated. Long, pause, long. We joked it might be tectonic breathing or some giant squid humming. Nobody said the word that later sounded like truth, the monster, because saying it out loud would make it real. The tide turned and the wind tightened. At about 5 in the afternoon, Poe relayed an image that made Logan swear. The camera caught a shadow moving with an intelligence that was not random. It wasn't the lumbering motion of a whale. It flowed, then stopped, then unfurled like a curtain. Something vast brushed the submersible with a force that felt like a hand, and Poe's lights flickered out. The sonar started to return a continuous, low-frequency tone, like a bell struck underwater and reverberating through your ribs. Helen's scribbles became frantic. "Record everything," she said. Roy barked orders. My hands were numb with the cold and something else I couldn't name. We hauled Poe back, the winch groaning, but when it surfaced, there was no obvious damage, just seaweed tangled at an odd angle and a smear of iridescent mucus across the camera lens. We wiped it and traced the smear in disbelief. Then the long tone returned, not through our instruments but through the hull itself, a vibration that made silverware on the galley table jitter. It came from the water, and it felt like the sea was inhaling us whole. That night, this is where the main part of my story begins, the ocean stopped being a place and became a thing intent on us. The first 500 words of my life that day are about who we were, the boat, the submersible, and the slow stacking of oddities that made the ordinary world lean toward something else. After dinner, when the crew had taken turns on deck, when the radio hummed with distant voices and the lights of Cape Hallow were nothing more than smeared stars, the sea changed its tune. We'd left the lights on for safety. Moonlight carved a path on the swell like a cracked mirror. I was on watch with Logan. Helen had gone below to transcribe notes. Roy slept in short bursts, old habits of a man who'd seen too many storms. Out of nowhere, a shadow broke the silver road, a dark line that rippled like a seam in fabric. It didn't crest, it flowed under the surface with a speed that made my stomach lurch. The water around it boiled, tiny, bright explosions of bioluminescence that spelled nothing so much as a warning. A sound rose, not loud, but enormous in scale. That low, bell-like reverberation again, but layered now with clicks and a chorus that sounded, I'm not proud to say this, like voices. We all heard it. Logan gripped the rail until his knuckles went white. Helen rushed up, hair wild, her notebook forgotten in her hand. The seafarer rocked, as if something vast had hooked our keel and tested how much rope we were made of. I thought of my father then, of the small, steady logic of engines and ropes, and I thought of the idea of monsters, which until then had been a story told on long nights to scare yourself awake. The thing in the water didn't look like the monsters we put on t-shirts. It was older, more patient, a geometry of muscle and suction and glow. It tasted the air. It tasted us. What happens next is the part that rewrites you. It is the part that turns stories into warnings and names into marks on a map. I remember the heat of fear in my face, the metallic tang on my tongue, the way the deck lights seemed too bright and too thin. I remember Logan's shout and Roy's cold command. I remember the moment the water rose to the level of the gunwale and an enormous limb, curtain of flesh, brushed my calf and left a welt like a bruise from a giant's thumb. We tried to run. We could not outrun the sea. The seafarer is small against an ocean that has teeth you don't see until they're in your hands. We fought with engines and ropes and hollers, and in the chaos a sound like 1,000 doors closing fell over us. The radio hiccuped and went dead. Helen, who had been all reason, screamed a sound I will never forget. When the morning bled into a thin, washed-out gray, help found us, not from the Coast Guard, but from a freighter that happened down our lane. They pulled us in, soaked and hollowed, and we told our story like men who have seen a ghost. Messy, insisting, certain. The seafarer was scarred in ways no inspection could fully explain. Barnacles arranged like teeth, lines melted into new, almost deliberate shapes. Poe's camera was gone. Bits of its metal skin clung to the rigging like confetti. People asked questions. Did we hallucinate? Did stress or gas or fatigue twist our senses? Official reports called it unexplained acoustic anomaly and closed the file. But fishermen on shore came to the harbor and spat on the deck and lit candles. An old woman named Ilsa, who had fished these waters since before Roy was born, pressed a shell into my hand and said, "The ocean remembers." Sometimes she takes a bite to remind herself. I tell you this not because I have answers, but because truth is heavy and strange. Since that night, I sleep with the windows shut, and the ocean is a presence in my dreams. Sometimes I wake and my legs ache where something touched me. Sometimes in quiet moments, I swear I hear it, the low, far bell, beneath all other sound, waiting. If you ever find yourself at the edge of the world and the sea looks like a folded blanket, remember this. The deep is patient, and it keeps things. We left a piece of our certainty down there, and it left a piece of itself inside us. This story is over. Get ready for the next one.